to do and all those sorts of fun things. So thank you so much to the library. Thank you to Anne for helping to organize this. And thank you to you all for sharing this time with me tonight. So I thought I would actually begin this hour by playing a brief video. It's only 5 minutes, but I think as you'll see, this video goes a long way to explaining a lot of things about my book. So what I have on the docket for us tonight is I'll play this 5-minute video. Then I'll give some excerpts, some readings from my book itself, and then I will open the floor to questions if there are any questions. And I thought maybe at the end of the night after questions, I would finish up with just one little brief reading of an excerpt from my novel. I always like to end with a reading rather than with the Q&A, just to sort of send us off into the night on a positive note. So having said that, again, because I'm teaching, I do kind of know how Zoom works. And so I'm hoping to be able to share my screen with you. So if you just give me a moment while I pull up this video and we take a look at it. All right, here we go.
Hi, I'm Amy Quan Barry. I'm also known as Amy Barry, Quan Barry, and AQB. This is me in 1989. I look really happy, probably because I know that 31 years after this ID expires, I'll write a cool book. This is what my book looked like back in July when my publisher sent me their first cover idea. My friend Judy Mitchell said this cover is triggering. So my publisher sent me a new cover. My friend Judy Mitchell then said this cover looks like the invitation to some kid's Halloween party. Personally, I can't tell if those are lightning bolts or stink lines. Happily, this is what my book looks like now. This is the North Shore of Boston, where I grew up. This is the city of Salem. Back in 1692, Salem was much bigger. Part of it was called Salem Village. Salem Village is where bad things went down in 1692, when a bunch of young girls started accusing people of being witches. Now, we can't get enough of witches. In 1752, Salem Village decided to put the past behind them and renamed itself Danvers. This was Danvers High, where I and my siblings all went to school. It doesn't look like this anymore, which makes us feel old. This is me in 1978. I'm on the left. For some reason, I decided to become the Danvers High band mascot. Oh yeah, I remember why. Because my sister Heidi was on the baton squad. I'm on the right. Heidi also made the bitchin' kilt I'm wearing right now. She has a shop on Etsy called Toolbox Design Store, all one word. So if you're looking for a ballet tutu, she's your man. In 1989, my friends and I played a sport called field hockey. For some crazy reason, they don't play it in Wisconsin, where I live now. This is our team freshman year. This is me being all edgy and cool and asymmetrical. 4 years later, this is us senior year. That's me, silently suffering from senioritis. This is me with my face painted at a pep rally. This is a field hockey pyramid without me. In 1989, we went all the way to the state championship in Worcester. This is us celebrating being awesome. Because it was 1989, we danced like this. And this. Boys wore their hair like this. We called it a mullet or hockey hair. Like this. And this. Girls wore their hair like this. We called it mall bangs or the claw. Like this. And this. This is what we wore to the prom. And by we, I mean me. This is also what we wore to prom. As you can see, my dog is really impressed. Finally, this is Barb Damon. Barb was our coach in 1989, the year we made it to the state championship. Barb passed away last year at the age of 82. She's the only person in my novel on whom a character is based, the character of Coach Butler. In conclusion, We Ride Upon Sticks is set in Danvers in 1989 as the high school field hockey team battles their way towards the state championship in Worcester, with a little help from this guy. Thanks for coming, and look out for number 1.
All right, wow. So thank you for sitting through that, and hopefully maybe afterwards you might have some questions. So as the video talks about, my book, We Ride Upon Sticks, takes place in the actual town of Danvers, Massachusetts, which again is an actual place. And like I said in the video, back in 1692, the city of Salem was much larger, and the area in it called Salem Village, where many of the events happened from which the Salem witch trials then followed. That area, Salem Village, became known as the town of Danvers, which is the place where my parents still live. You know, when I go home, it's still the place that I go home to. And so my book follows the 1989 Danvers varsity women's field hockey team as they're sort of a rags to riches story. They start off the season, they're really bad. They've been really bad for a while. And so they turn to the darker arts in an attempt to try and win games and make it to the state championship, which perhaps they do. You'll have to tune in to find out. So I thought tonight that I would read maybe a few excerpts from the book, just really brief excerpts, just to introduce you to the various characters and the feel of the book. So the first excerpt I'm going to read takes place at the annual fall sports pep rally. When I was in high school, this was an annual tradition every fall. All the different sports teams like football and soccer and tennis and cross country and field hockey and the whole school, we would gather in the field house and we would have a pep rally sort of wishing all the teams luck in their seasons. And so this opening scene that I'm going to read, basically that's what's happening. The school has gathered in the field house and the Principal Yoff, he's there presiding over the pep rally, and this is what happens. One thing I should mention, there's a reference right at the end of the section that I'm going to read. For those of you who are younger, you might not be familiar with the Budweiser theme song. So back in the day, the Budweiser horses, the Clydesdale horses, there used to be a lot of ads where you'd see these horses pulling the Budweiser wagon, and there was a theme song, and the theme song always said, "When you say Budweiser, you've said it all." And so there's a reference to that for those of you who are too young to remember the Budweiser theme song. So an excerpt from We Ride Upon Sticks. Then Principal Yoff was standing at the microphone trying to get the student body to shut up. When it finally quieted down, he said a bunch of stuff about Falcon's spirit, the trophy case outside the main office, the exceptionalism of Danvers High's young men and women, blah, blah, blah. We always wondered if Principal Yoff even liked pep rallies. The guy had a PhD in education from Wisconsin. Did he feel like a tool standing up there in front of the student body, yammering on about winning? We felt embarrassed for him when he concluded his speech with his fist in the air and a weak noise that we gathered from context was supposed to be some sort of rebel yell. We didn't even know, some sort of rebel yell. From there, the rally was pretty unremarkable until the hoop appeared. Karen Burrows and the cheerleaders had just gotten it in position, a big blue falcon painted right in the middle of it, when Jen Fiorenza turned to us and screamed, "Field, field, field, hockey, hockey, hockey," we yelled. And before any of us knew what was happening, we were charging the hoop, a herd of water buffalo stampeding on the African plain, Principal Yoff a casualty of our herd mentality, the guy buffeted every which way as we roared past. Jen was the first through, her claw a rhino horn, the paper tearing, each of us as if we were being born again, only to reemerge in a whole new world, all 11 of us pouring through. Abby Putnam, a ray of light, girl Corey, a woman scorned, Mel Boucher with the dark mark on her neck, boy Corey hoping nobody was looking at him, Becca Bajelica wondering why she hadn't worn a third sports bra, Sue Yoon with her hair dyed Kool-Aid and Crediberry, AJ Johnson wondering who among us really had her back, Heather Houston following blindly without her glasses, Julie Kaling like a monarch butterfly on its way to Mexico, little Smitty gnashing madly at the paper with her teeth. Be aggressive, be aggressive. The other fall sports falling in line behind us, football bringing up the rear, the marching band blowing their brains out, the cheerleaders screaming along to the Budweiser theme. When you say DHS, you've said it all. So yes, the infamous paper hoop with the Falcons painted on it, which we would always, run through each fall. So it was always sort of a rite of passage. The next section I'm going to read, we actually see the team as they begin to, look to the darker arts to try and figure out, how they might put together a winning season. So basically in the section that I'm going to read, what's just happened is the team has just had a rough outing. They just had a game, a field hockey game, that didn't quite go the way they expected it to. And now after the game, they're all gathered together in the locker room and they're talking about what they should do. And they're sort of arguing like, why, how come we didn't win that game? Maybe we should do this, maybe we should do that. And so they're sort of having this verbal fight about it. When suddenly, Julie Kaling stood up on the locker room's only bench. She didn't say a word, just held something up high in the air for one and all to see, waving the object around as if the thing was the answer to all our problems. Eventually, we quieted down and looked. It was an egg. We looked closer. It had a small face drawn on it in magic marker, 2 blue eyes with long lashes, a pert little pink mouth, some yellow curlicues for hair. What is that? Said Jen Fiorenza. Priscilla, said Julie. It's her baby, Heather explained. What? Health class, Heather said. We each got an egg we're supposed to take care of for a week. It's supposed to show us how hard it is to be a parent. It just makes me hungry, said little Smitty. How is Priscilla supposed to help us get to state, said Abby Putnam. Julie was now cradling the egg in her palm, patting it soothingly on the head. I'm willing to sacrifice her, she said in a small voice. We all stood there dumbfounded. Finally, a spark caught. Ah, you're saying we should egg someone, said Mel Boucher. Not a bad idea. Julie made a face. No, 300 years ago, the Salem witch trial started when a bunch of girls cracked an egg in a bowl of water to try and see the future. They wanted to find out who their husbands would be. Gently, she kissed Priscilla on the top of her eggy head. I'm saying we should crack Priscilla open and have her tell us what to do. We all stood around internally debating it. To prognosticate by egg or not to prognosticate by egg? That was the question. Anyone got a better idea, Heather asked. Yeah, we throw Priscilla at the door of the teacher's lounge, said boy Corey. So what, said girl Corey. They wash it off. Big whoop. What's an egg and water going to tell us, said Jen Fiorenza. Who knows, said Sue Yoon. If it doesn't work, no harm, no foul. No, really, Julie gets a 0 on the assignment, said Heather. I'll bring her a new egg, said little Smitty. Mrs. Tilson signed the bottom of each one, said Heather. Julie tipped Priscilla over. There it was, Mrs. Tilson's handwriting scrawled on the shell like a barcode. Julie, you up for this? Said Abby Putnam. Julie nodded. With her free hand, she undid her braid, letting her long black hair fall down her back like a superhero's cape, or maybe like a villain's. The best we could do was a clear plastic sandwich bag filled with carrot sticks. Heather Houston never ate the healthy lunch her mom always packed for her, instead each day buying 2 bags of sour cream and onion chips and a Suzy Q from the school store and tossing the healthy lunch on her way home. We threw the carrots in the trash and filled the bag with water. Julie Kaling did the honors. It was hard without a bowl. She cracked Priscilla on the edge of the bench and did her best to hold back the yolk. We watched as the white slid down into the bag, the thing like a big slimy booger. It's kind of like a human sacrifice, whispered Sue Yoon. Cool, said little Smitty. We watched as the egg white took on new form in the water. We're supposed to look at it by candlelight, said Heather. Julie Kaling had been lighting votives at the beginning of each day in her locker. She pulled one out of her bag. We turned off the lights and lit it. Then we looked long and hard. We looked harder than we'd ever looked at anything. Maybe it was all in the eye of the beholder. Yeah, it probably was. We all saw the gist of the same shape, but that's where the similarities ended. This is what we saw. Jen Fiorenza, a tail. Girl Corey, a car key. Boy Corey, a stamen and pistol. Sue Yoon, a TV antenna. Becca Bajelica, an erect penis. Mel Boucher, a fang. Lil Smitty, a rabbit's foot. Heather Houston, a candy bar. Julie Kaling, a thumb. A.J. Johnson, a pen. Poor Abby Putnam didn't see anything at all. In the darkness, she couldn't tell the difference between the egg white and the water. She worried that maybe now she wasn't getting enough beta carotene. Well, that was a whole lot of nothing, said Jen Fiorenza. She poured the bag with the dregs of Priscilla down a drain in the middle of the floor. Womp womp. Sometimes, you try and prognosticate by egg and it works out, and sometimes you try and prognosticate by egg and it doesn't. So, let's see. So in the next section, I'm going to read, basically what happens here is, the field hockey team, like a lot of sports teams in Danvers, at least back in the 1980s, we were always trying to have fundraisers. We were always looking to raise money to do different kinds of things so that we could buy, jackets, and we could, have swag that has our name embroidered on it and those kinds of things. So we were always looking to raise money. And usually the number one way that we raised money was by having car washes. So there was a place in Danvers, it was right downtown near the fire station, and we would show up and there was a space that you could sign up for, and then the firemen would help you turn on one of the fire hydrants, and so you had water. And so we would stand down there with signs, and cars would come and we would charge them, like $5 or so for a car wash. And it was a way for us to raise money. And so on a beautiful October day, the field hockey team decides that they're going to raise money. And it just happens, it turns out that it's actually Friday the 13th. It's October 13th. And so they're out there to raise money in this car wash. And this is what happens. I should also point out that, again, at this point in the novel, they've been, again, dabbling in the darker arts. And so they figured out that one of the things that helps them win games is when they do things that are sort of mischievous. That anytime they themselves do a mischievous act or an act that's bordering on being not necessarily criminal, but, kind of dark, that it fuels them, it brings them power, right? And so that's how they sort of keep their batteries charged, is by just kind of doing all kinds of little mischievous things all over town. And so again, this is what happens at their car wash. A silver Mercedes rolled in, its windows tinted a dark black, like peering head on into midnight. Girl Corey took the money Pro offered by two slim fingers slipped through the window, which the driver immediately rolled back up. She handed the money to Jen Fiorenza, who held the bill up to her face, poring over every inch of it as if she'd forgotten her loot. We crowded around, eager to find out what the deal was. On the front of the bill was some guy we'd never seen before, the guy with a beard and a ragged peninsula of hair projecting out into what would have been the water of his face. Ulysses S., said Heather Houston, our 18th president. As always, she was right on the money, pun intended. It was a $50 bill. Then we realized there were two of them. Girl Corey took the bills back from Jen and tossed them in the tin. We all got to work on what now appeared to us to be the most beautiful car we'd ever seen, the thing so stately you could bury the Pope in it. When we were almost done, Girl Corey slipped her own car keys out of her pocket. It was insane how breezily she did what she did. She might have been humming Moon River in her head. She might have been lazing by the ocean under a parasol in an impressionist painting. She looked so cool and collected. Blithely, she proceeded to walk the length of the Mercedes. With one hand, she pointed at something out in the road, as if whatever was out there had her full and undivided attention. But with her other hand, she slowly scraped her Fiero car key down the length of the Mercedes flank. My huckleberry friend, Moon River, and me. What are you doing? Hissed A.J. Johnson. The scratch was like drawing a Frankenstein scar on the Mona Lisa. Even Jen Fiorenza looked shocked, her claw with its mouth hanging open. "Don't worry about it," Girl Corey responded. With her knuckles, she rapped lightly on the Mercedes trunk, our signal to the driver that we were finished. With a sprightly toot of its horn, the silver convertible pulled out and sailed down Locust, its side marred like a tree that's been blasted by lightning. It was only later we found out the Mercedes belonged to Girl Corey's mom. And in less than a week, her mom was seen floating around town in some fancy new red contraption called a Lexus. They say a high tide lifts all boats. Guess it all depends on where you're standing in relation to the water. Girl Corey had her license plate officially transferred from the Fiero. Now the silver convertible with the huckleberry scar was all hers. Her stepdad, Larry, offered to get it fixed, but Girl Corey said no, she liked the Mercedes just the way it was. Ruined. We wondered if her parents ever suspected what really went down. All right, so yes, we always were looking to make money, like I said, by having car washes and things like that. So. Let's see. Other kinds of places to read from. I might actually start, it seems kind of odd now to do this, but I actually might start reading right from the beginning, right from the opening. I usually don't read from the beginning of a novel because I feel like, I don't know why, I usually don't, but I think I will now. So this is the very beginning of the novel. It basically opens before the season has actually officially begun. And so the entire field hockey team is actually at summer camp up in New Hampshire at the University of New Hampshire campus. So I remember when I was growing up and when I was playing field hockey that in the summer there was this camp that people would go away to. It was a sleepaway camp that you actually slept in the dorms and you would be there for a full week. And every year, you know, my friends would go off to camp and every year I wouldn't because my parents were like, you're not that good. You know, you don't really need to go to camp. It's not that big a deal for you. And so again, I would watch everybody else go off to camp while I was, you know, left home. And so anyway, so this just sort of shows you how the team is doing. Again, their very first scrimmage on like their very first day at summer camp. 2 minutes into the second half, Masco's number 19 took an indirect shot on our goal. For a moment, we lost sight of the ball and the scrum of players huddled in front of the net, the air blurry with sticks as if 100 defenders were trying to clear it and 100 others were trying to score. Considering how the first half went down, there really wasn't any reason for those of us on offense to keep watching, our defense porous as a broken window. True, our opponents, the Masconomet Chieftains, hadn't officially put it in the net, but it was a foregone conclusion, the ball already as good as in. Girl Corey turned and started the humiliating trek back to midfield. A few of us began to follow. Come on, guys, pleaded Abby Putnam as she watched our offense retake its positions on the center line, readying ourselves for yet another back pass that restarts play after a goal. They haven't even scored yet. No sooner were the words out of her mouth than the ball found daylight, shooting out of the throng and right through Mel Boucher's heavily padded feet. Abby hung her head, temporarily deflated. An empty potato chip bag went sailing by, a tumbleweed in the wind. Quickly, Abby pulled herself together and jogged back to midfield, where the rest of our offense was already waiting, our forward line fanning ourselves with our sticks like a flock of overheated Southern belles. The Chieftains didn't even cheer. It was 92 degrees in the shade. If we could have rolled over and offered our throats, our pale underbellies flashing in the July sun, we would have, each of us, a white flag. There were 28 minutes of play left. It was hard to know who was having less fun, us or them. Mel stood in the goal, whacking the earth with her stick like a guitar god trashing his Stratocaster. I'm gonna try that again. Mel stood in the goal, whacking the earth with her stick like a guitar god trashing his Stratocaster. Why had we thought this year would be any different? Wasn't that the very definition of insanity? Standing around with our sticks in the air, not marking our man, playing everything but the angles, yet expecting things to be better, the ball effortlessly sailing into the opponent's net. Usually when people talk about tradition, they mean the good things people pass down to who's ever around to take up the mantle. Usually tradition doesn't refer to stuff like whole seasons without a single win, or untold handfuls of broken fingers, split lips, or the time the bus got flat on the way home from an away game, double-digit drubbing, and we sat by the side of Route 1 for the better part of an hour, inhaling the world's exhaust. Yeah, so you can see there that it's going to be a long season for them unless they somehow manage to turn that around. So I thought at this point, I'm actually going to read some poems. And so, as was mentioned in the introduction, I got my start as a writer, as a poet. My MFA from the University of Michigan is actually in poetry. And I've published 4 books of poetry. And the first poem I'm going to read is actually, so I'm going to read 2 poems that are related to this novel. And it just shows you that the novel has been percolating in my mind for a very long time. And so this first poem is called Intramurals. And so many of you probably know intramurals, are usually when you're younger. When I was in elementary school, it would be that our team there were 5 elementary schools in Danvers, and we would play like other elementary schools, right? So that's intramurals, where there's intramurals, where maybe you're playing within, and intramurals, but we always called it intramurals. And so, I wrote this book. This is my first book of poetry, which came out in 2000, like 20 years ago. And I wrote this poem, and in the poem, it's about field hockey, and it's about the speaker's relationship to her mother. But it sort of shows you that I've always been thinking about women and sports, and women who play sports and their relationships to their moms, and just, the complicated nature of team sports and women. So it's just interesting to me that, again, that I've been thinking about this for 20 years, even though, again, I just published this novel this year. So this poem is called Intramurals. The first time my mother decided to come, somebody lost an eye. Almost, besides. Valedictorian, Ivy League bound, Lori Ardiff had no right being on the field. The 15 fibrous seams basting her eyelid together, a consequence of this. The second time, it was Zoe Burbridge who leaned into it, jumped back like a dancer with the spirit, her cheekbone split, fresh as an oyster. After that, my mom stayed home. 4 long years, not even trekking to the Berkshires, Nesson and the state championship, where I made that incomplete pass out of bounds, hands numb with December, the ball hard as an explicated tumor, pillaging, free at last. She said she didn't spend the 60s bra burning so her daughter could master the subtle art of bloodletting in a kilt. Suit yourself. Like marijuana, field hockey led to harsher things. Lacrosse, 2 semesters of collegiate rugby where I learned to take it like a man, dish the dirt, wrap my arms around the enemy's knees, and snap, the contact inflicted with affection. It's only now I remember the one who didn't get up, the girl they carried off the field in a fireman's stretcher, leg cocked back like a carbine. It goes without saying that I was exultant, frenzied with the power to cripple. Who wouldn't be? All those years, my mom stayed home, determined like a conscientious objector to blow this wall tumbling down. And I'll read a poem from my second book, which is called Controvertibles. And after I read this poem, I'd be interested in taking any questions. I can't see can I see the chat? We will look to see if I can see the chat. So I can see a chat. So if anybody has any questions, you could put those in the chat, and I would be happy to answer them. So I'm going to read one more poem, and then again, if there's any kind of questions or things like that, like I said, I'd be happy to address them. And like I said, you can always put those in the chat, or there might be other ways to ask me questions. And so if there are questions, I'll answer some. If not, then maybe I'll read like another section from the book, etc. So this is my second book of poetry. It's called Controvertibles. And so the poem that I just read, I think you could hear that particular poem, it's pretty narrative, right? There's a story in it. You could definitely follow the story of a speaker who plays these sports and how her mother decides, because she sees some horrible injuries, the mom decides that she's not going to go to any more sporting games. And so it's true that my first book of poetry, there's quite a few what we call narrative poems that tell stories. In this book is much different. It's a much more lyric book. It's not necessarily interested in telling linear stories. And so I tell stories, it's much more associative. So you'll hear there's a lot of images, there's lots of ideas, but it's not necessarily a linear narrative story that I'm telling in this poem. This poem is actually called it's a long title. It's called The Excavated Foundations of the Salem Village Parsonage as Recipients. And so the word recipients, I just stumbled on this one day in the dictionary and I was really taken with it. So basically recipients is just a beautiful word. And all it means is hindsight after the fact, right? Or it just means knowledge after the fact. So basically it's just hindsight, right? So I'm like recipients. It's such a beautiful way to say that though, to say like, oh, I wish I had knowledge after the fact. And so the title again is The Excavated Foundation of the Salem Village Parsonage as Recipients. And I'll also just say too, that if you're ever in Danvers, you can actually go to the place where the original Salem Village Meeting House used to stand. And that's where the Reverend Samuel Parris lived with his family and also with the enslaved woman that he bought, Tituba. And so again, they used to live in the meeting house. The meeting house no longer exists, but you can actually see the excavated foundation of it. So you can go and you can see again, the stone structure that's in the ground. So it can be a really interesting place to go and to look. And so, I was thinking about that and about that space for me when I was growing up was really important. Growing up in Danvers and having all this history about the witch trials around me, like I always just knew a lot about it. And I knew that it was unique, that, that most people didn't live in a space that was just so rich with history. And so I was just thinking about this particular space in the ground and just thinking about the idea of hindsight and knowledge after the fact. And so as you'll hear, this poem, like I said, is much more imagistically driven rather than the idea of narratively driven. But yes. The excavated foundations of the Salem Village Parsonage as Recipients. Like a mouth set in the frozen ground, and how our childhoods were informed by it, this innate sense of something missing. Even now, I imagine the girls were both pale and dark, like a flock of moons reflected in water, something seismic, languishing. What I would have done, they did, the night clear as broth, the fire pure volition. Who isn't desperate to see into the mechanism any way they can? I would have seen a house burning. I would have seen a man coming to me over water. I would have seen this place, its hold on me, the primacy of the deep image and the supplanting of narration. Where do we learn the art of explication? What can our origins teach us about who we should be? Then was the winter of small yellow birds, of visions. What this place suspended in the world beneath the world denotes, truth and its transmitting. All right, so those are my poems. And I see that there is there's some questions. So let me take a look at the questions and then I'll do my best to answer them. So a question from Jan. So why Amelia? So this is what her question says. Why Amelia? I love the book. I went to high school in the 80s and I love the references to hair, music, etc., especially Jen's claw. So why Amelia? Yeah, that's a great question. So again, I don't think it gives anything away because it happens pretty early in the book, like in the first chapter. As the girls are dabbling in witchcraft, they just have a common everyday notebook in the 1980s that has Emilio Estevez on the cover of this notebook. And they begin to use this notebook and that's where they record their names. It kind of becomes like a book of shadows for them. And it's where they make various pledges they just call it the darkness. Like it never gets very specific about who exactly in this darkness that they're calling on for power. But then after a while, they begin to refer to the darkness in general as Emilio, because Emilio is on the cover of this notebook. And so the question of like, why Emilio, which again is a great question. So the interesting thing is because of Zoom and because of COVID-19, I actually, I was back in Massachusetts when this book first came out, and I was fortunate to be able to do a reading in my hometown. And the very next day, Massachusetts just shut down. So this was like March 11th. But I was fortunate that a lot of my friends from the field hockey team actually came to my reading. And so we've actually kept in touch. There's 11 people on a team, and then there's also extended people too who, people substitute in and out. So the team is much bigger. But I would say that there's maybe about, 8 or 9 of us who've kept in touch. And so we actually had a Zoom reunion, just like, back in, maybe the end of August or in September, we had a Zoom reunion. And so when we had the Zoom reunion, I was teasing one of the women on the field hockey team, this friend of mine named Jen, because my memory of it is that her locker in high school and in junior high had, all the pictures of the heartthrobs of the day. And I, in particular, I remember that she had crushes on 2 people. And like I like to tell people, so she had these 2 actors and like all their pictures in her locker. And the thing is, with one of them, back in the day, we never knew how to pronounce his name. And so we would always be like, oh my gosh, Keanu Reeves is so dreamy. But because let's face it, Keanu Reeves is still around, like, 25 years later, 30 years later, he still has a huge career. And so the idea that if I had, if it was Keanu Reeves' picture on the cover of this notebook, people know who he is, he's still very much in the business. It maybe perhaps wouldn't have the sort of like humorous, impact that it does. And so I decided though to use Emilio Estevez instead, because again, he was somebody who was huge in the 1980s. And it's true, my understanding is that he's still very much involved in the business, but not as an actor. And so, I wanted to be somebody who'd had like a really big career, who was like about as famous as you can get, but who over time has, again, segued out and is no longer thought of as a heartthrob and things like that. So again, that was the reason why I used Emilio Estevez. I have to say, I found out, so after the book came out, people told me that he was here in Madison, I guess last year, because he's now more of a producer, more of a director. He directed a movie, I guess, called The Library, which I heard was really interesting, and that he showed it here in Madison. And I didn't know this. And so I'm like, if I know that, Emilio Estevez was here in Madison, I would have gone to his event. So maybe he'll come back some year. So that would be nice. So that is why Emilio, to answer your question. I can see another question I have. Let's see. It says, so many reviews I've read mention how well you captured the teenage experience. Was it fun to revisit that time of life? It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. And so, in writing this book, when your book is done and when you and your editor have decided on things, then at that point, your book actually goes to a copy editor. And so usually what happens is the copy editor is just somebody who, usually the things that they tell you have to do with, it's grammar. They might have suggestions about like, okay, maybe the sentence should be this or that. My copy editor went to town, and I feel really grateful that she did. She basically was a fact checker. You don't usually think of there as being fact checkers for fiction, but she fact checked the whole book, because it is true that all of the almost 99, I would say, % of the places mentioned in the book are actual historical places. So if they go to get pizza at Rocco's, there's still Rocco's Pizza in downtown Danvers. If they mention Supreme's roast beef, there's still Supreme's roast beef. When they go to the Liberty Tree Mall, the stores now are obviously different, but there used to be Cherry Webb and Terrain, or there used to be Leachmere's or Ann and Hope, And so I had this copy editor who would tell me things I kind of had forgotten. So for example, I had accidentally misnamed the sporting goods store that was on Water Street. She's like, no, this store was actually MVP Sports, not, Sports Authority. So she really knew all this stuff, which was great. And then I had a really great time rethinking the 80s and that kind of stuff. But I will say too, that it was really important to me to have fun, but to also be critical of the 80s, So oftentimes when we think of the 80s, we can sometimes just think of it as, oh, it was funny hair and people wore crazy outfits, and you had Madonna and all the bracelets and, the funny clothes like Cyndi Lauper. And, we like to listen to that music from that time. But obviously, if you go back and you watch some of the movies, if you watch some of the TV shows, there's a lot of misogyny, there's a lot of xenophobia, there's a lot of homophobia, there's all those kinds of things where they were considered like that you could get a laugh. Like you might on a TV show, there might be some kind of, joke made about a gay man, and it was like he was the butt of a joke or what have you. A lot of those movies, those teen movies like 16 Candles, there's scenes in them now that would not play well. I remember maybe last year I was on a plane on a really long flight, and I was watching Purple Rain, with Prince. It's like, in many ways, the music is amazing, but in many ways, the story of Purple Rain has not aged well at all. He basically hits his girlfriend a lot in that movie, and he beats her. And it's not really, it's the way it's portrayed in the movies, he beats her because he loves her and he's troubled, as opposed to, and yeah. So there's a lot of things about the 80s that have not aged well. And so it was important to me when writing about it, not just to show the fun side, but to talk about all of it, and to sort of recast it and be like, the 80s are a complicated time. The AIDS crisis is happening, crack cocaine is beginning to happen. The Central Park Five happens in the 80s, all these things going on. So I felt like it would be remiss of me if I just simply talked about like the funny things that we're all nostalgic for. And so I like to make the joke that in some ways the book is kind of like a green smoothie. I always drink a green smoothie where I put a lot of spinach in it. And so I feel like, hey, I just had spinach for breakfast. So woohoo, I can now eat whatever I want. But in doing that, having the spinach in your smoothie, you don't taste it because hopefully you have apple and you've got coconut water or you've got whatever, and that's what makes it taste good, right? And so here, it's hopefully you could hear that there's a lot of humor in this book. And because there's a lot of humor in it, like I hope that means that the social criticism, it's there and you can pick up on it, but it doesn't feel like off-putting. You're still engaged because the humor is keeping you invested in these girls and in their stories. And yet you can also, like I said, hear about the serious criticisms of, various social issues that were happening in the 1980s. So yeah. Are there any other questions? Again, those are the two that I see in the chat. But any other questions out there? So I was thinking, I don't know, and Anne, you can write that in the chat, but I was thinking I might read just like one more section or, so again, I don't really know. It's always so interesting to be doing these Zoom things because, obviously like when you're in person, you can look out in the audience, and you can see people and you can see how it's going. And like here, it's like, I'm talking to myself. Which is always an interesting thing. So I will read one more little excerpty thing, and then I think we will probably call it a day after that, unless any other questions pop up. So it would be remiss of me, particularly this time of year, if I didn't read a section about Salem. I have to admit that, the book has 11 chapters, and each chapter gives a little bit of a backstory about a particular character. And each chapter also features a little bit different team that the Danvers Falcons are playing. So this particular chapter is the Salem chapter. So it's the chapter where the Danvers Falcons go to Salem, Massachusetts, and they actually play the Salem Witches. It's true that Salem Witches, that is their name even now, but that's the team mascot for Salem Highs, the Salem Witches, which is I just love that as an idea. The football team, like they're the witches, and it's in the book a little bit, this idea that most sports mascots are masculine. There's very few sports mascots that are women or that are even just feminine or even just like gender neutral, and so I really like this idea of having, a sports mascot that is a woman. And so anyway, so the Danvers High Falcons travel to Salem on Halloween in the book, and they play the Salem Witches in field hockey. And then afterwards, because it's a late afternoon game, they decide to stay in Salem and to spend Halloween in what is essentially ground zero for Halloween, to spend it in Salem. I will say that when I wrote, when I was growing up, Salem and Halloween is very different than what it is now. Now in Salem, they have an entire month. I think it's called Haunted Happenings. And it's a whole month of very family-friendly things that happen in Salem. So, there's like hay rides and amusement parks and all these kinds of things. It's basically a way for Salem, quite honestly, to generate some tourist dollars. And it goes on all month. When I was growing up, though, in the 1980s, Salem was a little kind of seedy, actually, in certain kinds of ways. It's before, they really like renovated and made it much more touristy than it like it is now. So it was a little, and I actually kind of witnessed some of the things that that are about to happen in this particular section. So again, what's happened is, like I said, just to recap, they've played Salem High in field hockey, and they've just had dinner at a pizza place. And when they were having dinner at the pizza place, they ended up meeting these like guys from a local college who are there as well because they want to go to see the parade, the Salem parade, the Halloween parade. And so these guys are there to see this parade. And so basically at this point, though, the team has kind of given these guys the slip. They kind of snuck away from these guys. There's 3 of them, these guys who were, again, there to also watch the parade. And so the team is by themselves, and they're waiting for the Halloween parade to begin in Salem. We found a spot on a corner by Derby Street. The crowd was thin, the night cold. In a few hours, it would be November. There was nothing to do but wait. Becca Bajelica began twirling her stick like a majorette in order to keep moving and stay warm. Finally, we saw a cop car inching up the street, its lights washing the darkness with much needed color. This was it. Halloween was finally here. A few hundred people trailed silently in the cop car's wake. As they passed by, we realized it wasn't a parade. It was a memorial. Most of the people had on long black robes. Some wore witches' hats, others flower garlands wreathing their heads. One man had an intricate set of horns sprouting from his brow, the things long and twisted like an antelope's. He was marching behind a banner that said, "I walk the path of the ancient ones. Nature is my church." Other people were carrying signs that said, "Never again," under a drawing of a pentacle. "I don't get it," said Abby Putnam. "What am I missing?" "It's the Wiccans," said Heather Houston. "Who?" said Girl Corey. "Who?" said Girl Corey. "Wiccans, pagans, witches," said Heather. "I don't actually know if it's all interchangeable. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't." She started flipping through the book she'd just bought. "Actually, it says right here, all Wiccans are pagans, but not all pagans are Wiccans." "Speak English, Poindexter," said A.J. Johnson, her long black braids rustling behind her like fringe. Heather gave it some more thought. "I guess it's like the way all Catholics are Christians, but not all Christians are Catholics," she said. Even though this made sense, without uttering a word, little Smitty reached over and closed the book. Then a group of people across the street from where we were standing began to yell. One of them had a big sloppy sign that read, "John 3:16," and looked as if he'd scribbled it with his less dominant hand. Two others unfurled a banner that said, "Suffer not a witch to live." To our eyes, the people yelling weren't any spring chickens. It was kind of surprising to see a group of middle-aged folks who looked like they should have known better screaming themselves hoarse. "I know one of those ladies," said Julie Kaling, pointing at a woman in a gray peacoat. "She's from my church." "That is definitely uncool," said Boy Corey. "What, being a witch or being anti-witch?" said Julie Kaling. "Modern day witches don't believe in the devil," said Heather. "Pagans mostly worship Mother Nature. Christmas trees are a pagan ritual the Catholic Church co-opted. Much of the ceremony in the Catholic Mass comes from pagan times." "Whatever," said Julie Kaling. We watched as the parade slogged by. It was pretty anemic. It only took about 10 minutes to pass us. For a moment, it made you feel like the witch trials maybe weren't all that long ago. Somebody was throwing eggs. One hit a woman in the shoulder. She looked down at her soiled robe and sort of smile grimaced. "The least you can do is throw some bacon too, you coward," her friend yelled at the faceless knight. "We deserve a good breakfast." A.J. Johnson made a mental note to herself. Always be laughing. Then we saw someone waving at us. He was wearing a Red Sox cap. It took a moment to realize it was brunette Mark from Papagino's, he of the anchovy pizza fame. By the time we realized it was him, he had already crossed the street, so escaping out a side exit was out of the question. "Well, that was weird," he said. We couldn't disagree. "Glad you came?" he asked Julie Kaling. "Glad you came?" asked Julie Kaling. He said. It sounded like about the right answer. "We heard there's a party going down over on Gallows Hill," he said. "You guys want to come?" Abby Putnam blamed the lameness of the Halloween parade on what happened next. If the parade had been cool and fun and uplifting, if we had a chance to see some amazing costumes, maybe somebody walking around in an actual frame and dressed up as the Mona Lisa, then maybe we would have had enough and called it a day, headed back to our cars with a spring in our step. But watching people get screamed at by their fellow man leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Who wants to end what's supposed to be one of the best nights of the year on a note of baconless eggs? Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was so enjoyable. And thank you to everyone for coming. And I'm excited to reread this book. I'm excited to check out the poetry, and thank you so much for coming.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Mm-hmm.